two really great guests who are going to join us. So I'm going to bring them on. We've got Luke from 12 Gates. Welcome, Luke. Right?
Thank you for having me.
A few times. And we got Gavin, who's a CPI member from Illinois. Welcome.
So good
Gavin.
to be here.
So basically tonight, we're going to have both of these guys react to a piece of music. But before we do that, I guess maybe, we have quite a diverse panel here. I think the audience knows who I am, so I don't need to introduce myself. But maybe Luke and then Gavin should introduce themselves and their faith perspective and what they think they can contribute to the conversation here tonight. So go ahead, Luke.
All right, thank you for having me, Caleb. My name is Luke Jean. I run the channel The 12 Gates. I'm a Unificationist, which is a Korean-based Christian group located in South Korea and founded by Reverend Sung Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Jahan Moon. Although it originated in Korean Christianity, Unificationism presents itself as a interdenominational, even perhaps trans-religious movement seeking world peace through families. And I'm a member of this movement. I go to a local Family Federation church or a Unificationist church, and that's my background, and my channel focuses on theology and philosophy, but I'm always interested to talk religion, even on political shows such as yours, Caleb. So thank you.
All right. Good to have you here, Luke. And Gavin?
Yes, thank you so much for having me. My name is Gavin Lockhardt. I'm from Maupin, Illinois, which is right on the border of Iowa. And I originally, I was raised in a very secular home that didn't particularly believe in God. But as I became a young adult, I started to see scientific evidence that the Bible could be true, particularly Genesis. But for a few years, I kind of struggled with the issue of eternal salvation and eternal security, and I believed in a kind of works-based salvation. But the more I read my Bible, especially my New Testament, the more I led me to believe what I currently believe, which is that we are saved by faith alone, in Christ alone, through no one else, and that the faith that saves is a plain mental assent that does not lead to a changed life, not necessarily. And so I'm coming at it from an extreme perspective in many Christians' views. I'm a fundamentalist. I prefer that term rather than evangelical because I don't want to be associated with worldliness and horrible modern perversions of the Bible. So yeah, let's have a conversation.
And you're an independent fundamental Baptist?
Yeah, that's right. I'm an independent fundamental Baptist.
All right. Okay. So the reason I got these guys here today is they're both really experts on the topic of religion, and they both come from one interpretation of Christianity, very different interpretations of Christianity. And they're both my friends. I'll just mention that too, that they're both friends of mine. And about a year ago, I guess maybe 2-3 years ago, I came across this very, very anti-Christian song by Leon Rosselson, who was a kind of a leftist socialist folk singer in Britain. And Leon Rosselson, this is an image of him. I guess, he's still alive, and he's been a lifelong socialist. And his music, his main publisher is PM Press, which is kind of an anarchist publishing house that's headquartered in New York City and in Britain. And they promote his work and sell his albums. And I found a bio of him. It said, Rosselson, the son of a Stalin worshiper who never really lost faith, could see the intellectual and human absurdities and cruelties of socialism as practiced by Russia and its client states, but wasn't at all sure it was any worse than the consumerism, greed, selfishness, and international bullying of the US-led free world. That's how he describes himself. So I guess his father was a Stalin supporter, a member of the Communist Party in Britain, but he's kind of a new left Trotskyist, something like that. He's been singing songs since the 1960s, and he's got all kinds of albums about world peace. And one of his songs I actually do like, which is called the Song of the Old Communist, I believe. And it's kind of a reflective piece. But I discovered this very anti-Christian song that he's never actually apologized for. He does have an essay he wrote in the 2000s that kind of is like, well, maybe this wasn't the right thing to say or whatever, but he's never really apologized for this song. So before we play it, I guess I'll give both Luke and Gavin an opportunity. So Luke is hearing it for the first time with fresh ears. Gavin heard it for the first time earlier today. So I guess, we don't want to give anything away, Gavin, and I guess Luke can't give anything away because he's never heard it before. But is there anything you want to say before we put this song on, and then I let you guys react to it?
Well, before you revealed him as a Trotskyist with that description, I was going to say this is Trotskyism 101. When you started, that like you were reading his biography, and he was saying that the Soviet Union and the USA are both bad. It's like, I've heard that a million times.
There you go. And Luke?
Well, it's interesting that his father was a Stalin worshiper. In Unificationism, Stalin is seen as a actually antichrist figure, if you can believe it, partly because the way his imagery and iconography was displayed in many parts of Soviet Russia. Not so much his economic policy, although Unificationism has some literature on that, but more so the imagery. So it's interesting to hear that kind of description. He seems to be rebelling against the worshiping, or what he perceives to be worship of a certain figure. So that stood out to me.
All right. Well, very interesting. So if anyone has trouble hearing the lyrics or whatever, the lyrics are here. I linked the lyrics in the chat, and I'll put them in the private messages for the guests as well. So you can look over the lyrics in case there's any question about it, but we might as well get to it. And I guess, I know we don't want to be snowflakes here, but I mean, trigger warning. This is a very, very, very anti-Christian song. I have never heard a song that is more anti-Christian than this. Gavin's giving me a thumbs down. What do you mean? What do you mean?
Just signifying that the song is bad. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very bad. And I am offended by it on many levels. And, I assume Luke will be as well. So just, trigger warning, everybody. But the lyrics are there, and we might as well just get right into it. This is Leon Rosselson's own performance of his song, which I said he's never actually apologized for. He's danced around, maybe I shouldn't have done this, whatever, but he's never apologized for it. He kind of regrets it on some level. 1977, Leon Rosselson's Stand Up for Judas.
Were the masters when Jesus walked the land. In Judea and in Galilee they ruled with an iron hand. And the poor were sick with hunger, and the rich were clothed in splendor, and the rebels whipped and crucified hung rotting as a warning. And Jesus knew the answer, said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, said, love your enemies. But Judas was a zealot, and he wanted to be free. Resist, he said, the Romans' tyranny. So stand up for Judas and the cause that Judas served. It was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. Jesus was a conjurer, miracles were his game, and he fed the hungry thousands and they glorified his name. He cured the lame and the lepers, he calmed the wind and the weather, and the wretched flocked to touch him so their troubles would be taken. And Jesus knew the answer. All you who labor, all you who suffer, only believe in me. But Judas sought a world where no one starved or begged for bread. The poor are always with us, Jesus said. So stand up for Judas and the cause that Judas served. It was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. Now Jesus brought division where none had been before. Not the slaves against their masters, but the poor against the poor. Said son to rise up against father, and brother to fight against brother. For he that is not with me is against me, was his teaching. Said Jesus, I am the answer. You unbelievers shall burn forever, shall die in your sins. Not sheep and goats, said Judas, but together we may dare shake off the chains of misery we share. So stand up for Judas and the cause that Judas served. It was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. Jesus stood upon the mountain with a distance in his eyes. I am the way, the life, he cried, the light that never dies. So renounce all earthly treasures and pray to your heavenly Father. And he pacified the hopeless with the hope of life eternal. Said Jesus, I am the answer. And you who hunger, only remember your reward's in heaven. So Jesus preached the other world, but Judas wanted this, and he betrayed his master with a kiss. So stand up for Judas and the cause that Judas served. It was Jesus who betrayed the poor with his word. Crucifix, Christ's gospel has been spread, and 2,000 cruel years have shown the way that Jesus led. The heretics burned and tortured, and the butchering bloody crusaders, the bombs and rockets sanctified that rained down death from heaven. They followed Jesus, they knew the answer. All non-believers must be believers, or else be broken. So put no trust in saviours, Judas said, for everyone must be to his or her own self a son.
All right. Well, that was certainly not pleasant to sit through. But I have actually used that song in a class. I used it in one class I did on Trotskyism in Portland. I played it as an example of Trotskyite thinking. I guess I do have some more information I can share about the background or whatever. But I think we should let Luke react since he's hearing it for completely the first time. I mean, how did this strike you, Luke? What stood out for you?
Well, it's all based on a total misreading of the Bible. It's all based on, in the first stanza, in the first set of lyrics, where he's talking about how, well, Jesus said, pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but he's leaving out the other part, which is, well, you pay unto God what is God's. The teaching is not, oh, just, pay Caesar, pay your taxes, just be a good little Roman. That's not what he's saying at all. It's a total misreading of that verse in the Bible. And that's the starting point of everything else he says in the song, because what does the chorus talk about? The chorus talks about how Jesus didn't, serve the poor and save the poor. He sold out the poor. And it was Judas who actually somehow was fighting for the poor. That's just, I'm surprised at the massive biblical inaccuracy. You don't need to be, you can be a Catholic, a Protestant, evangelical, Baptist, Unificationist, and yet still you can't come to that conclusion without a lot of effort. So that's my initial reaction. It's based off of a total misreading of a.
All right. Well, I agree with that. Gavin, give us your reaction. You're muted.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with what you said there, Luke. There's no reason that somebody, being saved by, Jesus said, whoever believes in me has eternal life. And there's no reason that somebody who accepts that and gets saved by it would have to be, a sheep who never resists authority or just, slavishly obeys the government. I mean, the Bible does tell us to obey the government, but within a certain scope. And there's actually, some of the modern versions of the Bible have been mistranslated to make those commands seem even more obedient than they actually are. Another reason to use Byzantine-based Bibles like the King James. But let me start with the good in this song. The singing and piano playing are pretty decent. And I have to say,
forget the words. It's a great song.
It's like local Christian praises satanic song, right? Yeah. I'm not as offended as I thought I was going to be, at least not until the third verse, because honestly, I've heard stuff like this my whole life from secularists and progressive Christians. It turns out Leon Rosselson was in fact Jewish, but honestly, whether people are or not, there's a lot of people who seem to have this view, and I guess I found it a little bit refreshing, the fact that he was open about the fact that he thinks Jesus was the good guy and that Judas, he thinks Judas was the good guy and that Jesus was bad, because I feel like a lot of progressive Christians I know basically think that, but are too much of cowards to say it. And they basically think Jesus was a foolish, primitive person who had good intentions, but lived so long ago that he couldn't possibly know what we know, and other ridiculous, condescending views, blasphemous views like that. So I feel like it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. And I feel like this guy is like, okay, I'm a Trotskyist activist, I'm secular, I'm Jewish, I'm atheist, I'm all these things. I'm going to be open in your face about it, rather than, because what the progressive movement has done is try to sneak this view into Christianity. And so I'm glad this guy's being open about it. I always, it's interesting because the theory that Judas was a revolutionary who wanted to overthrow the Romans by force actually goes back to, Wilhelm Reda, which looks like Wilhelm, Wrede. I can type it in the chat. And that's in the 20th century, but I think there may have been some other also German scholars like that guy that might have advocated that in the 1800s, 19th century. So, of course, lots of horrible things have come out of Germany for a long time. No, that's nothing new right there, but including modern critical theory and as well. But so this idea that Judas wanted to overthrow the Romans by force, and that he turned Jesus in as an attempt to accelerate the revolution. Some people think, some historians and even some theologians think Judas was an accelerationist who wanted to accelerate the revolution against the Roman Empire, and that Jesus was against the violent route. Of course, Jesus was against violence, and Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight." So, we can see biblically that there are problems with this view about one of these German higher criticism views about Jesus and Judas. And I guess I'll say that just finally that I always roll my eyes when people say that the gospel was spread by violence, or that because I grew up in a community where most people did not believe in God, but cheered on the Israeli violence and genocide against civilians in Palestine, and this idea that religion motivates people to violence any more than this idea that Christianity makes people violent any more than any other worldview does, to me, is not upheld by evidence. And there's so many people who feel that they are free of Christianity or even free of religion in general, and yet they have these same or worse conquest mindsets, except it's worse because they're advocating that a secular Jewish state persecute people and kill civilians. Whereas when you look at not that it was great or anything, but when you look at Christian colonization of places, it's nowhere near on the scale of brutality of modern imperialism or modern Zionism. And of course, some people will point out that new technology is maybe part of why, and I would certainly grant that. But those are my initial thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, we seem to be having some connection problems. For a moment, Luke froze, but now Luke is back. But then Gavin was breaking up a little bit there. So hopefully we can proceed. As of now, it seems like we're hearing everybody. Just sometimes the picture isn't perfect. Do you want to say something?
Apologies.
Go ahead. You want to say something? Or
Oh, yes. Well,
it's go ahead. Yeah.
This idea at the end of the song that 2,000 years of Christian violence, and you have the Crusades, and they spread the gospel with the sword. It all stems from an inaccurate root. That's the big thing for me. It stems from a very inaccurate root. And the other thing about Judas it's an interesting thing you're talking about, Gavin, that Judas is considered by some biblical schools to be some sort of an accelerator for Roman revolution. If you look in the extra biblical literature, those pieces of literature that are not in the Bible, there are hints to Judas's motivation being, and of course it's extra biblical, it's not canonized, so Christians don't need or should necessarily buy into it, but there's a lot of hints that point to Judas was somehow jealous of Jesus because of Mary Magdalene. And this is where actually Reverend Sung Myung Moon derives Judas's motivation. In part, even though he didn't have access to the biblical literature, he believed that Judas's motivation was jealousy at the relationship between, or the closeness, not necessarily romantic, but the closeness between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. There's the apocryphal gospel of Mary Magdalene and of Judas that kind of in extra biblical literature talk about that. So there are many explanations as to why Judas may have done what he did. I personally don't believe it's simply just 30 pieces of silver and he was greedy. Of course, that's kind of the final, like, all right, Satan has you now. But the motivation, regardless of what it is, there's no argument in my mind in any of the biblical, extra biblical, or biblical schools or scholarship that somehow Jesus was being a fake in his regard for the poor, and that secretly Judas was the one who was serving the poor the whole time. I mean, granted, he was one of the 12 apostles, so maybe he did serve the poor, but there's no anywhere where it says Judas was secretly giving extra to the poor and blah blah blah, and he was so loving. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. So
so it's interesting. Luke, let me just jump in here, because so what came to mind when you said about Judas being jealous of Mary Magdalene, right? Judas is not mentioned that much in the Gospels. I think they kind of just decided not to talk about him. It's like if you have a friend who stabs you in the back, you might not, you don't like highlight your memories of them or whatever.
Right. But there's only the hints that, there's a betrayer. Who is it? And all the readers know it's Judas.
Yeah, but there's one incident though, which alludes to what you were saying, where I guess Mary Magdalene is washing Jesus's feet, right, with perfume. And Judas is offended by this. He's angry. And he says in like kind of a rage, like, well, that money could have been given to the poor, right? And then Jesus kind of rebuts him, saying, well, the poor will be with us always, but I will not always be here. He had knowledge that he was going to be crucified. And so that points to what you were saying about Mary Magdalene, though, because that seems to be one of the only incidents where Judas, and then I believe there's something about him stealing money, right? Didn't he like steal money? They like, there's something about him pilfering money from the disciples. Like he was taking money. And other than that, there's really not much about him. The claim that he was some kind of revolutionary, according to some sources and according to Rosselson himself, is based on the fact that they say that his last name, Iscariot, was not a name. It referred to an organization that means man of the knife or something like that. And it meant he was some kind of armed radical, or he was an assassin or something like that. That's what he bases that on. So there you go.
There's lots of stretched theories about the origins of. Can I just jump in here?
Why don't we let Luke finish? I interrupted Luke, so we'll let Luke, and then we'll go to Gavin. So go ahead.
No worries. I was just going to say, I mean, it is true that there were many in Jewish society, particularly the Zealots, and even there's evidence that John the Baptist himself was seeking a sort of violent revolution overthrowing the Romans. It's not that those people were not around. There were many people in occupied Judea that wanted a violent revolution and expected the Messiah to actually engage in that. The problem is the message the Gospels, all four of them, give is that Jesus was not the Messiah that the Jewish people expected. And therefore, to claim that he would be doing a violent revolution was kind of, incorrect in the eyes of Jesus and his teachings. And Judas seemed to buy into that because he was one of Jesus's 12 apostles. And there's no association that he was a zealot, which was the violent group of, more violently inclined, I should say, revolutionary group of Jewish people at the time. There's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and then there's other groups that are kind of in between them, like Jesus's group and John the Baptist's group. That's just all I would say to that. We're not saying that there were no people who wanted to violently overthrow the Romans. We're not saying that. We're just saying there's no evidence that Judas was one of those people and that Jesus was secretly, for the rich and for the Romans or something like that.
Right. Go ahead, Gavin.
Sure. I mean, there's lots of theories about Judas's last name. I mean, some people say it comes from an Aramaic word meaning deceiver or traitor. Some people say it's geographic, like you said, Caleb. Yeah, some people say that it might be related to some kind of Latin word for dagger. And I mean, I'm guessing that this Leon character Leon Rosselson is picking the one he prefers. But I mean, there's not a historical consensus on that.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, when you mentioned the Zealots, wasn't Simon one of the disciples? Didn't he come from the Zealots or something? Do either of you know the whole story there? I don't know the whole story there at all. Either of you want to know more about that? I guess.
Well, if you're talking about Simon Peter.
Okay.
If you're thinking of Simon Peter, Peter was a fisherman. I don't recall what group he was a part of, but whatever group he felt he was a part of, he dropped it. Peter who was known as Simon dropped it and
Okay.
joined them. But as to were any of them specifically from the Zealots, I do not think so. From my remembrance of the Gospels, I don't think so, but I could be mistaken. But they were
Gavin,
around. They were most certainly around.
do you know anything about that, Gavin?
I think, Caleb, you might be referring to, there's a Simon Zelotes in Luke 6:15, presumably one of the 12 apostles. And so, it's possible, I guess, that he could be linked to the Zealots. I don't want to say that certainly, but even if so, that's implying that not all of them are, and that, certainly, Jesus is not. And so it's people, when people try to say that the New Testament or the Bible is teaching their particular revolutionary ideology, they will often cherry pick and Texas sharpshoot and bend the facts to fit that agenda. So I think we need to start with the Bible rather than starting with a predetermined political agenda and try to make the Bible fit that.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to just observe about the song was most of the song, he's making the case that Jesus didn't believe in class struggle, right? And Judas did, which is a huge assumption, right? I mean, and so based on that, Judas was the good one. But then at the very end, it turns into don't follow any leader, right? Right. And it turns into leaders are bad entirely, right? It goes from Trotskyism of oh my gosh, we must have pure class struggle under all circumstances. You can't, and then it quickly at the very end, it turns into have no faith in leaders at all. Right. And then he makes an allusion to a quote from Karl Marx. He says, every man must be to his or her own self a son. Right. And let me there's a quote that's actually an allusion to a quote by Karl Marx, an anti-religious quote from Marx that I had here. Marx said, religion is only the illusory sun which revolves round man as long as he does not revolve round himself. Right. And that quote, it's interesting because he's talking about man in the collective sense, but I've seen it Jordan Peterson and others misrepresent it and say that Marx was referring to himself. He thought he himself, the individual, was the center of it. But that's what Leon Rosselson says. He says we should all be revolving around ourselves, which is the exact opposite of Jesus's message, right? Jesus
totally anti-Christian.
Lay yourself down. And Leon Rosselson is saying, you should be purely selfish, which also doesn't sound very socialist either, right? I mean, that sounds kind of the opposite. He's supposed to be this big socialist. So, I thought that was interesting as well. So it started out as just kind of this ultra Marxist interpretation of, Judas is the real revolutionary. Jesus is some kind of, I almost it's almost like he's saying Jesus is a televangelist, right? He's a televangelist, giving people hope and ripping them off to get money. Jesus is Joel Osteen or something, and Judas is, this true revolutionary. And then at the end, it turns into you shouldn't have a leader at all, and you should be purely selfish. So it oddly contradictory, I thought. I guess Leon Rosselson said he wrote it because he saw a sign somewhere that was urging people to repent or else they would die in their sin. And he was offended by that sign. And that's what inspired him to write the song. So I guess Gavin looks like he wants to react to that. And then we'll go to Luke. Go ahead, Gavin.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have in response to what you're saying with Rosselson, I have a comment about Jesus. I have a comment about Marx. And I have a third one I'm forgetting. So where shall I start?
Go ahead. Yeah. Start.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say in response, yeah, Jesus offended a lot of people. The gospel is offensive. I will say this. Okay, I'm gonna quote John 11 here in the Bible. Jesus said to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." unquote. And I just wanted to say, notice the assurance that Martha had. She didn't say, well, Lord, I'm not sure because I'm not perfect. No, she was sure. And this is an eternal life passage. And I wanted to say that with regard to Marx, I believe that Karl Marx got saved when he I believe that Karl Marx was saved when he was a teenager or younger, but that he was an apostate. I believe that Karl Marx was saved, but that he was an apostate because Karl Marx clearly got saved when he was a teenager. He clearly put his faith in. He clearly believed in Jesus for the free gift of eternal life. He wrote about it, and that gets scrubbed out of collections of Marx's works because I think communists are kind of embarrassed of that. Of some of the young Marx writings are Christian. There's at least 3 writings from Karl Marx.
I didn't know that. I knew that his family converted when he was 14. I knew that but I heard it wasn't sincere. I heard it was just so his dad could get a job. His dad wanted a government job.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way to know for sure. I mean, I'm not a mind reader. In that sense, it's possible that Marx was never saved and has eternal death and was just writing stuff to, I don't know, pass his high school religion class or college religion class or whatever. It's possible. I'm not a mind reader, but in my opinion, the Bible teaches that once you're saved, you'll always be saved, even if you apostatize, fall away from the faith. But unfortunately, Marxism did go around spreading atheism to quite to some extent. The extent to which Marxism has spread atheism has been exaggerated. And today, Marxist countries are more friendly to Christianity and specifically to fundamentalism than capitalist countries are. But there definitely was a time when Marxism was associated with atheism, and Karl Marx definitely became an atheist.
Oh, no question about it. Yeah.
And I was talking with an Irish Catholic socialist who was trying to tell me that Karl Marx had a deathbed conversion or something. But I tell you, I don't think that's true, and I don't think there's any evidence for it. And so I'm not for example, I'm not saying these things because I want to believe them. I just want to be clear. There are some very counterintuitive facts. I'm trying to go from a biblical perspective. I'm an independent fundamental Baptist, and I mean, for example, I think that Karl Marx had a lot of moral flaws, but by a biblical definition, I think he's saved. I think Joseph Stalin, was a much better person than Karl Marx in terms of how many people he helped and the good things he did in life. But I don't think Joseph Stalin was saved because I've not seen evidence that he believed in the free gift of eternal life. So I went on some rabbit trails there. Maybe that'll mentally stimulate both of you to this.
Well, before we get to Luke, I want to respond to that because this is something I've spent a lot of time talking about. I think that, socialism as an idea was around long before Marx was around. It was widespread. And it was just this vague understanding that in modern capitalism, we focus on individualism too much and that people are being left behind and that the rule of money has certain problems with it. And socialism was around as kind of a vague concept. What made Marx's understanding of socialism unique, and this is what it really is hammered home if you read Critique of the Goethe Program, if you read anything, is he's said that the way we're going to get socialism is it's going to be a struggle between the capitalists and the workers, right? It's going to be on the basis of conflict. And that Marx was very much infected with the spirit of the age, this belief that conflict and struggle is the way you get everything. And there's actually a really short piece that Marx wrote where it was you were supposed to describe what is it? What is your goal? Who's your favorite person from history and all of this. And in that piece, he actually says, what is the, your ideal state of being? And he wrote to fight, to be in conflict. That was his ideal way of being, right? And that he very much, there were all these other socialists that were saying we could build socialism on the basis of this will be good for the country. And Marx was saying, well, no, we're going to build it on the basis of a conflict between the worker and the capitalist, right? And that was very much the spirit coming out of the French Revolution, this idea of conflict, right? And it was kind of the opposite of what in feudalism, there is no conflict. Everyone's born into their place and you are in your place and you have your place and you die in your place, right? And in feudalism, also, everything is justified in the name of religion. The king has divine right. The church is the law. You can be burned at the stake. And so Marx is the anti-feudalism, right? He's taking the spirit of the rebellion against feudalism of, struggle is the essence of life. It's the essence of reality. And on top of that, he's saying that, that there is no religion, there is no spiritual anything. All that exists is matter. And that taints his ability to really, that there is this kind of, that kind of like rage that comes across that really, I think that was almost like a curse that hung over Marxism. And you mentioned like Marxist countries are not like that anymore. And yeah, I think that Marxist countries are largely moving toward a socialism that's much more like people like Düring, right? The big Marxist book Engels wrote is Anti-Düring, and it's all about this German socialist who was saying that we can build socialism on the basis of having a strong country, moral values. If you look at China, China's not promoting class struggle. Like their message, it was a block of 4 great classes to rescue the country. And even now, they're not promoting class struggle. If anything, it's more like Düring's vision of socialism. They've kind of gotten away from that. And that I view almost like socialism and Marxism as it's come into the world as a result of the Russian Revolution. It's gotten further and further away from this notion of, class struggle and conflict being the basis of it. And you almost get like, it's almost putting out a message of kind of oneness and national unity. And, and like the wild thing is that the woke people, though, a lot of them love Marx. They really love Marx, and they hate all those countries. And they just love that aesthetic of rebellion. They love, you have nothing to lose but your chains, rebel, tear everything down. But they actually hate all the countries. And the countries tend to actually, promote like more traditional values. Other than Cuba, I don't know of any communist country that has gay marriage, for example. None, right? And that, Stalin, when Stalin promoted the Soviet family, for example, Trotsky attacked that, and he called it the Thermidor in the family. He said it was an attack. Stalin outlawed abortion. He outlawed homosexuality. And as far as the whole thing about Stalin, in Russia, there are many, many people who believe Stalin was a Christian because he went to seminary school, and because after the Second World War, he built so many churches and he legalized the Russian Orthodox Church. There's no proof of that. That is a legend. Right. And it's a very widely believed legend. Like you can even watch YouTube documentaries. There are people in Russian Orthodox churches that claim, yes, Stalin came here in a coat once every Sunday to pray, and he didn't want anyone to see him. And I'm not saying any of that's true, but that is a really big part of the Russian, they call it the new Russian patriotism that kind of came in with Putin, is the notion of Stalin as a Russian Orthodox savior of the nation who drove out the invaders, who restored Great Russia. And that's a big part of Russian Orthodox theology, is the notion of like Great Russia. So I'm fascinated by the legend of Christian Stalin. I find it really fascinating. And it really just kind of flies in the face of everything that we know about both politics and religion in America, right? Because it doesn't make sense, but it does in Russia, right? Even though I'm not saying it's true, I've never seen any confirmation that it's actually true. I find that fascinating. That's actually what my book, Mystical Stalinism, I kind of touched on it in here. I wrote this text, Mystical Stalinism, kind of touching on that legend. And I find that to be fascinating. I'm not saying it's true, but it's kind of like, if something is not true, but people widely believe it, it tends to hint that there's like a grain of truth in it, even if it's not actually true. And that's one thing that I've noticed. Like, so it's like, maybe that isn't actually true, but you can see like Stalin did go to seminary school. The leaders of the Bolshevik Party that Stalin persecuted tended to be Jewish leaders. The Jews were highly overrepresented in the Bolshevik Party, and Stalin persecuted them. And so there's an element, maybe not even consciously, that Stalin was kind of bringing his kind of Christian background into trying to fix the Soviet state or something like that. That's a whole longer conversation we can get into sometime that I find fascinating. But yeah, I mean, I feel like this song, in a weird way, and I guess I'll talk more about this later, but like Gavin said, it's more honest. This is what I think a lot of Marxist atheists really believe. And they try to dance around it and tap dance around it. But this is, rather than trying to make Jesus into one of them, they're just kind of writing a song to repudiate Jesus and make Judas the good guy. That's kind of how I see this. And that's why I appreciate it. And I also, Judas is a traitor. He's the symbol of betrayal, right? That's basically what he's the symbol of. And he's the backstabber, right? He's like Satan. He's the fallen angel, right? Satan betrayed God, is an angel who betrayed God. Judas was a disciple who betrayed Jesus. And that many people have said that Trotsky is Satan in the communist narrative. He's Judas in the communist narrative, right? And that's in 1984, for example. The Goldstein character is based on Trotsky, right? And that almost that people that are quote unquote anti-totalitarian say that if you're going to have a totalitarian movement, you have to not only have a Christ figure, you have to have a Judas figure. So on that, I will hand it over to Luke.
Well, a whole bunch of stuff to discuss there. I will just highlight a few things that stood out to me. I think the premise of the Communist Manifesto, for example, which is the work of Marxism I most studied in, the Communist Manifesto, it starts out with this premise of history is about class struggle. That's the fundamental flawed root, I feel, of Marxism, in the manifesto at least. When you view things as purely class struggle between those who have capital and those who do not in various iterations throughout history, you are doing, as you said, narrowly focusing on one aspect of the human existence, and there are a myriad of aspects of the human existence. Then you get to, okay, well, how do people organize? Do they only organize in class? No, they organize by ethnic group, by religion, nation, of course, tribal groups, all sorts of groups people, organize in. So to narrow it down into class and capital is fundamentally flawed. And then his resolution, of course, is to violently overthrow the bourgeoisie. In other words, anyone who has capital. He says, oh, well, if you have a small little shop as a proletariat, okay, we won't take that away. We won't violently revolt against you. But everyone else who has property, anyone who's an owner of anything, violently take the property and redistribute it. And what I noticed, another flaw for me was that it doesn't end there, because the redistributive mechanism is not the proletariat, as individuals, but it highlights the capital as state. And this is where Orwell comes in with Animal Farm in 1984 and basically says, okay, Marxism's not accounting for human nature. Karl Marx already did not, for example, account for the various other ways that people organize themselves. There doesn't seem to be much human nature involved in, the Marxist ideology. So what will happen if there's a capital S state that's in charge of the redistribution? Inevitably, Animal Farm, you have the pigs. The pigs, realize that they have power, and then they fight amongst themselves, and then they are the, dictators of that society, and, wreak havoc against the, proletariat that, had a revolution. So for me, those things, are critical flaws in Marxism that I think, when played out, have had devastating effects. And granted, is, Leon Rosselson being more honest in his song? Sure. But his call for and basis of the song, I think, just like in, when I talked about the biblical quote, the basis of his song comes from, this sort of Marxism, which I think is fundamentally flawed, I think. And granted, there's not that much of a proliferation in terms of class struggle, class revolution in, for example, China. But for me, you still have the state there as pretending to be the redistributive force that in actuality targets many religious groups, including my own, the Unification Church, among plenty of other Christian groups. And, you have the Uyghurs, for example. And, China's one example. There's also North Korea. They promoted, the Marxist communist ideology. Then it totally shifted into totalitarian Duce ideology, where the Kim dynasty is a dynasty of gods, essentially. Even if you don't have their photo hung up, you are arrested, probably, tortured or killed. And it's not true.
No, but that's okay. Continue. It's okay.
Oh no, no, because I'm curious. I'd like to be challenged on anything I'm saying.
Well, we're not here to talk about North Korea and all of that. Please continue. We don't want
to. No, I'm
you.
sorry.
Yeah.
I gave it. I was just giving it as an example. And anyways, for me, and like you said, Caleb, what are the woke people doing, and what is, as Gavin, you talked about, what is people based in critical theory doing? They're adopting it to devastating effect. And so I guess that's what I think of when we talk about, what the roots of Marxism produce. It can produce potentially some good, but when you have only the, narrow-minded class struggle through capital, you have the wokies, you have the, like you're talking about the Trotskys, you have the those type of iterations that are not good, not healthy.
All right. Go ahead, Gavin.
So I said a lot there.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff. I would agree that Marxism is flawed, but in my opinion, the flaw in Marxism is not so much in the class struggle part, but in the secular worldview part, the evolutionary worldview, where this idea that, you know, over billions of years, particles became people and through accidental mutations and this. So, I mean, the class struggle part is, it shouldn't be done violently, but I think definitely there are different classes that are incompatible with each other. And I mean, there are societies that have made some of the more harmony of classes, like China. I'm not saying there's no exceptions to it, but I think that the flaw in Marxism is in the secularism that is so often paired with it. And I think that I would also say that some of the atrocities committed by Marxist governments, I think, pale in comparison to how many ways they've helped people and given food to people, literacy to people. And I think that, I'm definitely against wokeness and critical theory, but I think that wokeness and critical theory Marxist atheists throw the baby out with the bathwater. They think, because, you know, and Marx himself, like you were saying, Caleb, they associate religion with feudalism, and therefore they think religion is bad. But the woke people, they've taken only the aggressive secular part of Marxism, right, and they've thrown out the economics and you could even say they've thrown out the class struggle part in some ways. And I think that so there's a lot of things to say there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I don't know quite where to begin. One thing that I often bring up in these kind of discussions is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, was very much an atheist, and he also was a very, very, very strong opponent of any notion of socialism or communism. And he attacked it on the grounds that it was just Christianity. That's actually what he wrote. He said that he said Marx had just reinvented a secular version of Christianity. And he said the doctrine of the lowly makes for lowliness. And he claimed that communism, Christianity, and Judaism were all slave religions, slave morality. That claimed that it was something that the downtrodden and poor people made up to feel righteous in their suffering. And that he wanted to go back to ancient Roman and ancient Greek paganism because he thought it was superior. And he then celebrated colonialism because he said that it was causing the Europeans to give up their Christendom and just become ruthless and cruel. And he wrote about the blonde beast. And he said that when the Europeans were going to Africa and slaughtering people and killing them, that was great because they weren't trying to do right and wrong anymore. They were just doing might makes right. That's, that Friedrich Nietzsche is the basis of philosophical irrationalism, right? And that's the destruction of reason by Lockhardt. He shows that basically Nazism and Nazi war crimes, the basis of it was Nietzsche, right? It was this belief that there is no reality, there is no right and wrong. And so with my willpower as an individual, I can choose what's right and wrong and just make it so by doing so, right? And that is the basis of much of the evil. And that I believe it's very interesting. ContraPoints, who's one of these like woke anti-communist, but like woke leftist YouTubers, she did a video about religion. And in the video, she did not highlight any of the Marxist works on religion. She highlighted Friedrich Nietzsche and his book Beyond Good and Evil. And she championed philosophical irrationalism and these very, very notions on here. And that the postmodernist and the academic crowd, they may draw from Marx and Marx's critique of the West because it's useful in like deconstruction. But at the end of the day, they are philosophical irrationalists. What they believe is kind of what Rosselson believes at the end of his song, where he says, be your own, basically just be selfish, right? Be in and of yourself and just make your own rules. Don't have any saviors. Don't worship anything. Just be purely selfish and follow yourself. And I believe that's what the rich actually believe behind closed doors, right? I think that some of the people who rule over us pretend to be Christians. Some of them don't, but at the end of the day, what they really believe is they believe in Nietzsche or Leo Strauss or Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand talked about the virtue of selfishness, right? That's really what they believe. What I also thought was interesting was that, so you have the Nietzschean critique of Christianity, basically, or of communism, saying communism is just Christianity, because it's saying that the poor will get saved, and that there's a battle between right and wrong, and that, then on top of that, in Germany in like the 1900s, when the German Social Democratic Party was rising, they published a book, which I have quoted many times, called the Foundations of Christianity by Karl Kautsky, where they argue that Christianity was the Roman proletariat, the wage workers of Rome, expressing themselves, right? And that Jesus was a carpenter, which meant he was a skilled craftsman. He wasn't a slave, but he was a wage worker. And that it was the Roman proletariat of Rome. It was their kind of mystery religion that they used to assert themselves, and that Christianity was the first working class movement. And Kautsky tried to present Marxism as like, we're just kind of an updated, modern, secular, scientific Christianity. And that's what Kautsky was trying to argue. And that's what he argues in Foundations of Christianity. In the book, he argues that Jesus was a zealot and was a composite of various zealots who'd been martyred. And that's what he argues, as that there were various zealots who had led revolts against the Romans, and that they took different legends of them, and the Jews in Rome that were wage workers and not slaves, as they built this movement to fight for their rights against their employers, they like incorporated different legends of zealot leaders who'd been martyred and crucified, and they made the Roman religion. And he points to the fact that there are some of the words of Jesus were apparently said by Roman, Roman philosophers, and that they argue the early Christians were pulling some of the Roman philosophers. Like, I think the phrase "as ye sow, so shall ye reap" was said by like Seneca or somebody like that, or something like that. I think that's from the Old Testament, though. I don't think Jesus said that, but I think isn't that from the Old Testament? Gavin would know, but Gavin, is that from the Old Testament?
He's quoting the Old Testament. Yeah.
Yeah. So Jesus was quoting the Old Testament anyway. So maybe those Roman guys also heard it. I don't know. So I don't know. He does that, and that in Germany they were trying to repackage Marxism as just kind of a secular reinterpretation of Christianity. That was a really, really big part of German social democracy, and that's the party that Marx built. Right, as Marx was dying, as Frederick Engels, Marxist collaborator, they built the German Social Democratic Party. That was the flagship Marxist party in the world. And what happened is that party sold out and supported World War I and sent millions of workers off to die at the end of in World War I, and discredited itself completely. And then at the end of World War I, when Germany was collapsing, that party was basically handed power. And then it killed its most true believer, Rosa Luxemburg, who was trying to actually have socialism in Germany. And then they killed her. And that German social democracy, what Marx believed, German social democracy kind of, discredited it. Bolshevism, what Lenin did was kind of a weird spin-off of Marxism. Lenin had this theory about the national question, about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He developed this kind of secret society. And the Marxists, the people who actually knew Marx, considered Lenin, what he was doing, they said it was a cult. They said this is an authoritarian, illiberal cult. You're saying things that Marx never said, that nations are good. You have this whole theory of capitalism as imperialism, and that Leninism was like a spin-off, like a weird spin-off of Marxism that was invented, that actually did end up taking power. And everywhere you've actually seen like an actual like Marxist government come into existence, it's been a Marxist-Leninist government. It's been that Leninist interpretation. And I'm at the point where I admit that, yeah, I think Lenin completely changed everything that Marx was about, and that was good. And I think Stalin changed what Marx and Lenin were about, and that was even better. And I think Deng Xiaoping took it even further. And I think that, honestly, what started with Marxism has taken on just a completely new, we have a new economy in the world. You wouldn't have the BRICS economy in the world today if it wasn't for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. But I look at the BRICS countries and I don't see dialectical materialism. I don't see class struggle at all. I think they took some Western ideas to make their revolutions and gradually got further and further away from their ideas. And now what's going on in the East is something that is complete. It has nothing to do with Marxism or any other Western ideology. I think it's just a completely new thing. I think the Eastern civilization, the Western civilization is very, very different foundationally. And that because the West had intellectual dominance, they had to use, they were going to form some kind of Western ideology to lead their movements to establish independence. But now we've got a whole new economy and a whole new world that exists. And that largely, I don't see the countries around the world that are kind of outside of the West or broken with the West. I don't really see them as putting into praxis Karl Marx's ideas, but that's good. I like what they're doing. And I actually think they've reinvented things. And I think having, a market sector in a socialist society like China's done is great. And I think, supporting nationalism is good. And I think supporting the traditional family is good. And that the ways that the anti-imperialist countries have deviated from Marx, I think is actually good. So that's what puts me as I'm like the opposite of Rosselson. I'm the opposite of a Trotskyist. The Trotskyists look at the Marxist countries and say, you've sold out. And I say, well, actually, yeah, they have. And that's good. So there you go. And the woke people are sticking with kind of the mindset of Marxism. And that's very bad. So that's my provocative thought. I'm sure Luke and Gavin have something they want to say about that. Go ahead, Luke.
I've never heard that take before, ever. That, people have gone beyond Marxism, and those that have done so it's good. And those who are sticking with original Marxism, it's not good. Like the woke people, for example. That's a very fascinating view of the development of Marxism. I will say I read Beyond Good and Evil about 2 years ago, and I was floored by, first of all, just the writing style. It's so complicated. It's like, my God, this is an extremely difficult book to read. And I noticed that thing you talked about where Nietzsche said, no, he's calling Christianity slave morality, and that you need to go back to the Romans and the Greeks. And Nietzsche even argues that the Jewish religion is far less of a slave morality than Christianity was. And he sticks in that kind of, you need to get out of the slave morality and have will to power, and you need to eventually create your own morality. This is the fundamental flaw that I think Nietzsche has. He points out a lot of, I would say, fair critiques of late 19th century Europe, and kind of, he warns of totalitarian regimes coming. He warns about it very clearly in Beyond Good and Evil. His sister was the one that, after Nietzsche died, kind of meddled with Nietzsche's writings and made it into more Nazi-esque writings where it's pointing to a German superiority complex. But, I didn't even have my mic up. But I'm so excited. But that's the fundamental problem. If you think you can create your own morality with a blank slate as an Übermensch, you have big problems coming. Even though he warned about totalitarian regimes, even though he had fair critiques of late 19th century Europe, you get creating your own morality in part from just saying Christianity is a slave morality that, quote unquote, only serves the poor. And so that's what I would say about Nietzsche, having read Beyond Good and Evil. In addition to your very fascinating take on, the development of Marxism, I really have to think about that. I've never heard that anywhere, ever.
There you go. Go ahead, Gavin. You're muted.
Yes. I was that was on purpose. Yeah. So I wanted to just clarify. Yeah, my mistake. So the thing about as you sow, so shall you reap. Apparently that is from it's in Job and it's in Proverbs and it's quoted by Paul in Galatians, but I can't find Jesus ever saying that. So I think you're right. In terms of what you were saying, forgive me for being abrupt, Luke, because I wasn't trying to cut you off or stop you from talking. It's totally good to have. It's totally good to have criticism of North Korea, and I'm thankful that in the USA we have free speech, we kind of have free speech. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of Uhuru didn't have free speech when they were put on trial but anyway, but of course, we have the freedom to criticize. But I will say this though, that I just wanted to point out that, and I think North Korea has problems. It has poverty. It has authoritarianism. But people have taken tourism videos with a phone, and they've gone into Catholic and Protestant churches in North Korea, and you can clearly see in those churches that there are Bibles and that there are no portraits of the great leader. So I just wanted to point that out. But as for redistribution of wealth and the kind of, you mentioned about the problems of having a violent revolution and to redistribute wealth to proletarians, from taking it from the bourgeoisie to proletarians. I don't really think that that's so much what socialism and communism have been about in history. I think that all governments and all societies redistribute wealth to some extent, but I think that the core of Marxism and communism is having so much abundance that people no longer fight each other, and that I think, well, speaking of redistributing, speaking of proletarians and redistributing wealth to them, I would also, Caleb, you mentioned Karl Kautsky. I have a couple of strong disagreements with that book. One of them is the idea that, and maybe I'm splitting hairs a little bit here, but the idea that Christianity was an expression of the Roman proletariat. I mean, yeah, that may be true what he's saying to some extent, but Christianity, the evidence shows from its inception, was multi-class, and there were wealthy people, and there were slaves who were below proletarians, and there were all kinds of people that had lots of representation in Christianity. Another issue, I mean, Kautsky makes a lot of interesting and claims, and is certainly very thoughtful. But another thing I would disagree with him on is this: he acts like it's some big proof of it. It's some big red flag or contradiction in the Bible that Jesus, that Jesus was identified by a kiss from Judas, and Karl Kautsky makes a big deal about the fact that, like, oh, you're saying that this famous street preacher had to be identified? Like, of course they would have already known him, right? Ha ha ha. But no, in fact, I mean, back then it's not like they had broadcast news or even newspapers, and so it's not really at all necessary that a fairly well-known preacher would have to have his face known by everyone. And so I just think that there are some interesting points definitely made in Karl Kautsky's book, but to Christians I would caution there are also some fallacies and the idea that Jesus was a composite figure. Again, maybe I'm splitting hairs, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that he was an individual who's, even atheist historians like Bart Ehrman would say that the evidence is overwhelming that Jesus was an individual whose believers thought that he did miracles, many miracles.
Yeah.
And so I think that sometimes this deconstruction thing can go a little too far, but that's another topic perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the whole redistribution of wealth thing, I mean, that's the kind of thing I talk about for hours and hours on this YouTube channel about. But like, I spent a long time, when I was a communist, I was in the Workers' World Party, and I would go around selling communist newspapers, and people would say to me, oh, I don't believe in communism. You want to take my house, you want to take my car, and I don't want to do that. And I would say to them, well, actually, no, what we want to do is we want the major industries to be publicly owned and operated so we can have a rationally organized economy. We don't want to take your personal property. We want to maximize and increase personal property by abolishing private property and the means of production. That was the point I would always make. And what frustrated me is I'd spent all this time explaining, no, we don't want to take your house. No, we don't want to take your car. And then Bernie Sanders came along and said, we're going to increase everyone's taxes and then give people health care. I'm like, I just spent my whole year telling everyone that's not what and that conservatives were saying that socialism is taxation. And I was explaining, well, no, it's not. We want to increase your personal wealth by centrally planning the economy. And then the woke people just came along and, oh yeah, socialism is taxation and it's good. And that so much of what the woke people do is it's like, it is this kind of, it's funny. I talk about Satanism. Like I view this like philosophical irrationalism, this idea that I, with my individual willpower, can define morality. That's Satanism, right? But I there's also what they call like teenage Satanism, which is just whatever mom and dad say, you have to do the opposite. So much of what woke people do is they take the caricature of what communism is to a conservative, and they're just like, yeah, I don't want to work. I want to be lazy all the time. And it's just juvenile, and it's not helpful. And that there's so much of that. Like, I for a while, I think there was a Reddit group called like anti-work or something. Right. And it was some kind of like weird, like, intellectual wankery about like, we'll eventually create a society with no work. But of course, Fox News did like big stories about, all these, young socialists are on a website that means they don't want to work. And, and it was just like, so much of what they do is just, it's like designed to create antagonism, and it's not very well thought out, And I mean, the point that I always make about redistribution of wealth, there's that quote from, what's her name? the British, who was her name? The Iron Lady. What was her name? Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher. And she said, well, socialism doesn't work because eventually you run out of other people's money. And I would always get angry when I hear that, because it's like, if all Stalin had done is redistribute other people's money, the Soviet Union would never have been an industrial superpower that, invented space travel and built huge power plants and all of that. Like, and I mean, if all they had ever done in China was just redistribute other people's money that was already there, they never would have turned China into the second largest economy that existed. And I had spent my whole, time as a communist going around telling people, we want to centrally plan the economy so that it's rational and works in the interest of everybody. We don't want to take your money. And now, this notion that socialism is about taking everyone's money, I mean, it's just normalized. And so it's just, and it's like, and that's kind of why we've kind of transitioned in CPI. But the other thing, though, that I will say, and I think this is something Luke would probably really strongly agree with, I mean, based on my limited knowledge of Unificationism, is that and this is, I've discovered the work of Wallace Wattles, who was a socialist, but, definitely not a Marxist, more of a Christian idealist. The idea that you're going to build a movement that's based on poor people resenting rich people, that can't lead to anything good. And I've learned that in my personal life. Anything that I do in my life that is motivated by jealousy is not going to lead any, you're not going to build a healthy movement in any way, whether it's in an individual level, whether it's you getting together with a group of friends to go after somebody, anything that you do that's based on like somebody's got it too good and I want to take them down. That's Satan. That's going to lead you in a bad place. And this phrase, abolish billionaires, my understanding of what Marx wrote in Critique of the Goethe Program was, we wanted to centrally plan the economy so that the amount of wealth in society could go up so much that everyone could live like a billionaire and government goes away. But now AOC and Bernie, and that's like a big thing, abolish billionaires. Well, if somebody has enough wealth that they're a billionaire, good for them. And I would like as many people as possible to have that level of comfort and security as possible. I'm not angry that some people have it good. I'm angry that some people don't have it good. And I want a society where that opportunity is there for as many people as possible. And I feel like those are healthy. That's a healthier appeal, right? But if you're appealing to people on the basis of resentment, no matter what your movement is, it's not going to be good, right? And that, that's where like kind of this, this, whether it's from the left, it's like an economic thing, or from the right. I mean, I think anti-Semitism, the crude anti-Semitism out there is, oh, Jews have it too good. I'm mad at them, so I'm going to take them down. Well, that's not, obviously that has led to a lot of evil things in this world, and so I don't know. I view this, as like, I think what Marx observed about the problems of the capitalist economic system and the belief that, that if we centrally plan things, that in the developing world, there are countries that have done that and been able to lift themselves out of poverty and industrialize. And I look to that for inspiration, but I don't pretend those countries, had an easy time doing it. There was a lot of brutality and a lot of repression and a lot of hardship. In the process of doing that, those countries have very much shed that, the Cultural Revolution in China was all about jealousy and going after people for their class background and their perceived privilege. And now China looks at that as like an awful, awful moment. When I was in China, I went to the Communist Party Museum and I noticed that the Cultural Revolution, other than an ending, that's all they said about it. They mentioned in the Deng Xiaoping area, and it ended. That was it. They're not proud of the Cultural Revolution. They realized that kind of fomenting that mass resentment that they fomented, it really hurt the country economically and was a disaster. So I don't know. I mean, that's kind of my thing, is that my critique of Marxism is a spiritual critique. I don't critique it economically so much. I critique it spiritually. And the reason I used that song in the class on Trotskyism was because I saw that song as like, it's celebrating a traitor, basically. And and then it ends with just follow yourself and don't follow a leader. I see that song as like, that's the wrecker mentality that prevents us from building the real kind of anti-imperialist movement that we need, right? Is that people are, first of all, it's like a movement of resentment. I want to tear down the rich. And then it becomes, well, I resent other people in my organization and I'm jealous of them. And really, we shouldn't follow leaders. We should just be our own true son and all of that. You can't really build any kind of organization or movement that's ever going to accomplish anything with people thinking that way. And so those are my thoughts. So I want to give you both an opportunity to just end as however you want, and we'll wrap this up. So talk as long as you want to wrap this up. First Luke, then Gavin, and then we'll probably be done. So go ahead, Luke, say whatever's on your mind, and then Gavin, and then we'll be done. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I mean, I think one thing I realized from our conversation is that I agree with you in your critique of Marxism in the sense that unificationists' critiques are spiritual. They're not economic critiques are out there. There's a theory called the end. There's a book called The End of Communism by Sang-Hung Lee, one of the early followers of the unification movement. But even that, everything starts from that spiritual perspective, and that's where I'm coming from. For me, when I read the Communist Manifesto, when I read Marx's works, I sense a spirit of resentment. And I sense oftentimes that purposeful violent revolution, in order to affect some sort of social change, usually is backed by the spirit of resentment. And that's why I'm pretty against it. Unificationism actually has in its ideal society, if you look at its philosophical explanation of its teachings called Unification Thought, when it talks about the ideal society in an economic sense, it is very much a redistributive economy where everyone has enough, everyone lives according to their means. There is an element of central planning, but it's all voluntary. There's this idea that in order to defeat Satan, you must get Satan to voluntarily submit through love, through peace. Otherwise, Satan will never surrender. Satan will keep going and going and going and going. The point of the cross is that Jesus won over Satan because of his love for all humanity, to sacrifice himself on the cross. And the result of that was that we all can attain salvation. That's the beautiful message of the Bible, that Jesus was able to defeat Satan through love, not through violent means like the Jewish people thought he would. They thought they would defeat the Romans, they would defeat evil through a violent, uprising. But it was that voluntary course to go to the cross that allowed him to win the final victory. And that would be my critique of Marxism, is that we don't necessarily need, and I don't think it will actually promote permanent change, to redistribute through a violent revolution and the means of the state. I think the more long-lasting solution is through a voluntary means, which is what I sense you're doing, I think, as CPI, and what the stories you talked about when you were a communist selling the newspapers, it seemed very like, I want to help people voluntarily believe in this, not F the billionaires and, destroy the billionaires and all these sort of, wokey things. And so that's where I think we have some agreement. But that it makes me realize, okay, what is exactly my perspective? It's that spirit of resentment. It's that you can't, do things through violence. You have to do things through voluntarity and peace, which the unification movement believes in, especially with unity between North and South Korea. Not through violence, through peace. Be peaceful to North Korea at all costs. Do not escalate. Do not escalate with Russia. Do not escalate with China. Do it through peace and voluntary cooperation. That will achieve mutual prosperity. And that's what I'm about. And I thank you for your challenges and your insights into Marxism and its, play out throughout various countries and movements throughout history.
Great. Well, thank you, Luke. And we really appreciate having you on here. And this has been a great discussion. So now I have to let Gavin give his conclusion. Go ahead, Gavin.
Yes, well, going with kind of what you're saying, Luke, I think that both the most extreme free market people and the Bernie Sanders type people, they may think that they are building a better world, but what they end up doing is fighting over scraps, And then I guess, another category of people is the people who support the war against Iran. I mean, those people are fighting over scraps, thinking that, there's only a certain amount of oil in the world and that we can profit from, and therefore we have to bomb Iran to smash the competition. That's a hateful scarcity mindset that's built on resentment and jealousness and defeatism. But I don't want to fight over scraps. I want people to have so many opportunities that everyone should be able to have, not to be, bathing in gold-plated pools, but that everyone should have the freedom and the security and the options in life that a billionaire has. so that people are not killing each other. Because, World War II was mentioned. I mean, this idea that there's some group of people that has it good is really an exaggeration. I mean, most people are hurting right now, and you look at the world economy, and there's a lot I guess we could say here, but I will just kind of wrap it up by saying that I know that right now Caleb is representing an innovationist perspective. Luke is representing a unificationist perspective, and I'm representing a Baptist perspective, or you could say a fundamentalist perspective. But I guess to try to incorporate all three of them, I'll say that fundamentally, if you want to innovate or you want to be unified, you have to be alive. And so, there's no, you can't innovate anything if you die in a nuclear war, and you can't be unified with people or, with your relationship to God if you're 6 feet under, at least not until you resurrect again, in my view. And so we need to do everything we can to do our little part in stopping what is this horrible march toward a nuclear war that's going on in the world right now. But there's actually one thing in this world that's even more important than stopping a nuclear holocaust, and that is you have eternal life. And I will say that Jesus said, "He who believes in me has everlasting life." And he went on to say, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And there's so many verses that could be, and some of the people watching this stream may already believe that Jesus lived a sinless life and that he died and rose again. But you know what? Just believing that Jesus is sinless and rose again won't give you assurance of eternal life. And millions of people believe those things, and yet they lack assurance. Unfortunately, because it's sadly possible to believe that Jesus died and rose again, yet not believe in his promise to freely give life to all who believe in him. And you know what? Let's go to the Bible one last time. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." And, Paul said, by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of works. It is the gift of God. Grace, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. And I will say that the words faith and believe have become over spiritualized in our vernacular. But if you look up the original meanings, they are just when you think something is true mentally. That's what Jesus demanded of people to have. If they want to have eternal life, they need to believe in him mentally, that he's the one who gives it, or is authorized to give it by the Father, that he's the Son of God. And so that's my appeal to everybody in the audience. You can be Christian and anti-imperialist. You can be anti-imperialist and Christian, and there's really no contradiction there. The contradiction is the rejection of eternal life. That's my opinion. Thank you both so much.
All right, great. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Gavin. And wow, I'm sure both of you will be back soon, because that was a lively discussion, very wide ranging. So thank you. And thank you.
Thank you both. And it was great to meet you, Gavin.
You too, Luke. You both have a good night. Stay safe out there.